the story of Odysseus does not truly begin on the open sea, nor even with the hero himself, but in the ashes of Troy, where victory and destruction are inseparably bound. After 10 brutal years of war, the Greeks finally brought the great city to ruin, not through strength or honor alone, but through deception. The Trojan horse, conceived by Odysseus, king of Ithaca, whose mind was his greatest weapon. This act secured Greek victory and immortalized Odysseus as the most cunning of heroes. Yet it also set the moral tone of what would follow, for the fall of Troy was not a clean or righteous triumph. The sack of the city was marked by slaughter, enslavement, sacrilege, and arrogance. And though Odysseus was not the most violent among the conquerors, he failed to restrain his men or fully honor the gods in the moment of victory. In the ancient Greek worldview, such failures were never without consequence. The gods watched closely, and the seeds of Odysseus' suffering were sown amid the ruins of the enemy city. Odysseus was already a complex figure before leaving Troy. Unlike Achilles, whose heroism was defined by overwhelming physical power and emotional intensity, Odysseus embodied a different ideal: intelligence, adaptability, eloquence, and strategic thinking. He was a master of words as much as weapons, equally capable of persuasion, deception, and patience. Yet these strengths were inseparable from weaknesses. Odysseus was proud of his intellect, deeply conscious of his reputation, and often driven by curiosity even when caution would have served him better. These traits would repeatedly endanger him and those under his command, shaping a journey defined not only by external obstacles, but by internal conflict. When Odysseus finally set sail for home, he commanded 12 ships filled with seasoned warriors who, like him, longed to return to their families after a decade of war. Ithaca was not a grand kingdom. It was a small, rugged island, poor in resources but rich in meaning. For Odysseus, home was not merely a destination, but a symbol of identity, order, and continuity. His desire to return was not driven by ambition or conquest, but by the wish to resume his rightful place as husband, father, and king. Yet the journey from Troy to Ithaca, which should have taken weeks, stretched into 10 years, transforming Odysseus from a victorious warrior into a figure defined by endurance and suffering. The first stop on the journey revealed how quickly victory could turn to loss. Odysseus and his men landed in the land of the Cyclopes, allies of Troy, and attacked their city, Ismarus. The raid was initially successful. The Greeks plundered wealth, killed defenders, and took captives. Odysseus, however, understood that the longer they remained, the greater the risk, and he urged his men to return to the ships immediately. His warnings were ignored. Drunk on victory and eager to celebrate, the men feasted on the shore, convinced that the danger had passed. This moment of indulgence proved fatal. The Cyclopes regrouped, summoned reinforcements from inland, and launched a fierce counterattack that drove the Greeks back to their ships, killing 6 men from each vessel. This early disaster established a central theme of the epic. Intelligence unheeded is intelligence wasted, and leadership cannot fully compensate for the weaknesses of those who refuse discipline. As Odysseus sailed onward, storms sent by hostile gods scattered his fleet, driving them far from their intended course. These storms were not random forces of nature, but manifestations of divine displeasure, signaling that the journey home would not be simple or swift. Eventually, Odysseus reached the land of the Lotus Eaters, whose inhabitants lived in peaceful isolation, free from labor, ambition, or memory. They offered Odysseus's men the lotus plant, which erased longing and erased the past, leaving those who consumed it in a state of contented forgetfulness. Several of the crew ate the lotus and immediately lost all desire to return home, preferring the numb comfort of the present moment to the uncertainty of the future. This episode, though brief, carries profound symbolic significance. The lotus represents the temptation to escape responsibility and suffering by abandoning memory and purpose. Odysseus recognized this danger instantly. Rather than reasoning or pleading, he acted decisively, dragging the affected men back to the ships and tying them beneath the benches until the spell wore off. His response reveals his deep understanding of the human condition, that the greatest threats are often internal, not external, and that the loss of memory and identity is more dangerous than any monster. For Odysseus, to forget home was to cease being fully human. The journey then led Odysseus to the island of the Cyclopes, where his defining qualities, curiosity, intelligence, and pride, would collide with devastating consequences. The Cyclopes were lawless giants who lived without agriculture, governance, or respect for the gods. Odysseus, driven by curiosity and the expectation of hospitality, explored a cave filled with food and livestock, choosing to wait for the owner rather than taking supplies and leaving. This decision, motivated partly by confidence in his ability to manage any situation through cleverness, proved disastrous. The Cyclops Polyphemus returned, sealed the cave with a massive stone, and began devouring Odysseus's men alive, showing no regard for human or divine law. Confronted with brute force beyond any hope of physical resistance, Odysseus turned once more to deception. He introduced himself as nobody and offered Polyphemus strong wine, which the Cyclops drank greedily. When Polyphemus fell asleep, Odysseus and his remaining men drove a sharpened stake into his single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus cried out in agony, claiming that nobody was attacking him, the other Cyclopes dismissed his pleas, believing him to be mad or divinely afflicted. Odysseus then escaped by clinging beneath the bellies of Polyphemus's sheep as they were led out to pasture. This escape stands as one of the greatest demonstrations of Odysseus's intelligence, yet it is immediately undermined by his most destructive flaw. As his ship sailed away, Odysseus could not resist revealing his true name, boasting of his victory and identity. This moment of pride transformed triumph into catastrophe. Polyphemus, realizing he had been deceived, called upon his father Poseidon, god of the sea, to curse Odysseus. The Cyclops prayed that Odysseus would reach home only after long suffering, having lost all his companions, and that his return would be filled with grief and turmoil. Poseidon heard this prayer, and from that moment onward, the sea itself became Odysseus's enemy. The consequences of this curse unfolded steadily. Odysseus next encountered Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who welcomed him generously and provided a bag containing all adverse winds, leaving only the gentle breeze needed to carry the ship safely home. For the first time since Troy, Ithaca lay within sight. Yet once again, human weakness sabotaged success. Odysseus's men, suspicious that the bag contained treasure, opened it while he slept. The released winds hurled the ships back across the sea, erasing all progress. When Odysseus returned to Aeolus, the god refused further help, believing that no mortal so hated by the gods could be aided without inviting divine punishment. The journey grew increasingly brutal with the encounter with the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals who destroyed nearly Odysseus's entire fleet. Ships were crushed against cliffs, sailors seized and devoured, and only Odysseus's own ship escaped, largely because he had anchored apart from the others out of caution. This massacre marked a turning point in the narrative. The voyage ceased to be a collective endeavor and became a story of gradual isolation, stripping Odysseus of companions and leaving him ever more alone against the will of the gods. By the time Odysseus reached the island of the enchantress Circe, he was no longer merely a returning hero, but a survivor, hardened by loss and increasingly aware of the limits of his control. Circe transformed many of his men into animals, erasing their humanity. Yet Odysseus once again overcame enchantment through divine aid and intelligence. His year-long stay with Circe marked a pause in the journey, a moment of rest and temptation that foreshadowed even greater trials ahead. Thus, by the end of this first phase of his journey, Odysseus had already lost most of his fleet, earned the personal hatred of a powerful god, and learned through repeated suffering that intelligence alone could not guarantee safety. The path home had become a test not only of cleverness, but of humility, restraint, and endurance. The hero who left Troy in triumph was slowly being reshaped into a figure defined not by conquest, but by survival. When Odysseus arrived at the island of Circe, he was no longer the confident commander who had departed Troy with 12 ships and high expectations. He had become a leader marked by loss, suspicion, and hard-earned caution. Most of his fleet lay at the bottom of the sea. His men were exhausted and fearful, and the curse of Poseidon loomed over every horizon. The island itself appeared deceptively peaceful, thick with forests and alive with the sounds of unseen animals. Yet this tranquility concealed one of the most profound dangers Odysseus would face. For Circe was not merely a monster to be defeated, but a force that threatened to erase the very essence of humanity. Circe was an enchantress, a goddess-like figure who lived apart from human society, exercising complete control over her environment. When Odysseus sent a group of men to explore the island, they encountered her palace surrounded by strangely tame animals, wolves and lions that behaved like pets rather than predators. This unsettling harmony hinted at Circe's power to reshape nature itself. She welcomed the men with warmth, food, and hospitality, but the meal she served was laced with magic. With a simple gesture, she transformed them into swine, reducing proud warriors into animals that retained human consciousness, but were trapped in degraded forms. This transformation is deeply symbolic. Circe does not kill her victims. She strips them of dignity, reason, and identity. In doing so, she represents a threat more insidious than physical violence: the erosion of what makes a human being human. When Odysseus learned of his men's fate, his first instinct was despair. Yet divine intervention arrived in the form of Hermes, who provided him with a magical herb that would protect him from Circe's spell. Armed with this knowledge, Odysseus confronted the enchantress, resisting her magic and forcing her to restore his men. Yet the relationship between Odysseus and Circe did not end in violence or escape. Instead, it evolved into a complex alliance marked by intimacy, mutual recognition, and shared understanding. Odysseus remained on Circe's island for an entire year, living in comfort, enjoying pleasure, and recovering from the trauma of his journey. This extended stay reveals one of the central tensions of the epic: the conflict between the desire for rest and the obligation to continue forward. Circe's island offered everything Odysseus lacked: safety, abundance, and freedom from struggle, but it also offered stagnation. Time passed without purpose, and memory threatened to dull into complacency. It was not Circe who urged Odysseus to leave, but his men, who reminded him of Ithaca and the responsibilities waiting there. Their reminder shattered the illusion of contentment and forced Odysseus to confront a painful truth. Comfort without purpose is a subtle form of captivity. Recognizing this, Circe shifted from seductress to guide, providing Odysseus with crucial instructions for the next phase of his journey. She revealed that before he could return home, he must travel to the land of the dead and seek the prophet Tiresias, for only Tiresias possessed the knowledge necessary to guide him safely through the trials ahead. The descent into the underworld marks one of the most psychologically significant moments in Odysseus's journey. Unlike earlier dangers, which tested physical endurance or cleverness, this journey required Odysseus to confront mortality, memory, and the consequences of his actions. The underworld in Homeric tradition is not a place of moral judgment, but a realm of shadows, where the dead exist in diminished form, deprived of vitality and joy. To enter this realm is to acknowledge the fragility and impermanence of life itself. Odysseus followed Circe's instructions precisely, sailing to the edge of the known world and performing the proper rituals to summon the spirits of the dead. When the shades gathered, drawn by the scent of sacrificial blood, Odysseus stood at the threshold between life and death, sword in hand, holding back the crowd until Tiresias appeared. This act of restraint underscores the discipline Odysseus had begun to develop, contrasting sharply with his earlier impulsiveness. Tiresias's prophecy was both illuminating and sobering. He confirmed that Odysseus would eventually return to Ithaca, but only after great suffering, and only if he respected the gods, particularly the sun god Helios. Tiresias warned Odysseus that if his men harmed the sacred cattle of Helios, disaster would follow, leaving Odysseus alone and broken. Even after reaching Ithaca, Tiresias foretold further trials, including vengeance against the suitors and a final journey to appease Poseidon. The prophecy reframed Odysseus's journey not as a series of random misfortunes, but as a structured path shaped by choice, restraint, and consequence. Beyond Tiresias, Odysseus encountered other spirits whose presence deepened his understanding of human suffering. he spoke with fallen heroes of the Trojan War, each revealing a different perspective on glory and loss. Achilles, once the greatest of warriors, confessed that he would rather live as a servant among the living than rule as a king among the dead, a statement that shattered the heroic ideal of eternal fame. This revelation profoundly affected Odysseus, reinforcing the value of life, however difficult, over hollow immortality. The most emotionally devastating encounter was with the spirit of Odysseus's mother, who had died during his absence. She revealed that she had wasted away in grief, longing for her son's return. This moment forced Odysseus to confront the unseen cost of his prolonged journey, the suffering of those left behind. No clever plan or heroic deed could undo this loss. It marked a turning point in Odysseus's character, replacing ambition and pride with humility and sorrow. When Odysseus returned from the underworld, he carried not only knowledge of the future, but a deeper awareness of mortality and responsibility. This transformation shaped his actions in the trials that followed. One of the most famous of these was the encounter with the sirens, whose song promised wisdom, beauty, and ultimate understanding. Unlike earlier temptations, Odysseus chose not to avoid the sirens entirely, but to experience their songs safely. He ordered his men to block their ears with wax and bind him to the mast, instructing them to ignore his pleas, no matter how desperate they became. This episode encapsulates Odysseus's evolving character. He no longer relies solely on clever improvisation, but combines foresight, discipline, and self-knowledge. He understands his own weaknesses and designs safeguards against them. The siren's song represents the seductive pull of absolute knowledge and self-importance, and Odysseus's survival demonstrates that wisdom requires boundaries. Beyond the sirens lay the narrow strait guarded by Scylla and Charybdis, a passage that symbolizes the inevitability of loss in leadership and life. Circe had warned Odysseus that no ship could avoid danger entirely. One must choose between two evils. Charybdis threatened total annihilation, while Scylla would claim only a few lives. Odysseus chose the latter, steering close to Scylla and sacrificing 6 men. This decision haunted him, not because it was wrong, but because it was necessary. Heroism here is stripped of glory and reduced to responsibility, where survival demands acceptance of moral compromise. The final test of obedience came on the island of Helios. Despite clear warnings from Tiresias and Circe, Odysseus's men, weakened by hunger and despair, slaughtered the sacred cattle while Odysseus slept. Their act was not driven by ignorance but by resignation, reflecting the erosion of discipline and hope. When Odysseus set sail again, Zeus destroyed the ship with a thunderbolt, killing all the crew and leaving Odysseus alone at sea. This moment fulfilled Poseidon's curse and marked the complete collapse of Odysseus's role as leader. Stripped of men, ships, and command, Odysseus was reduced to a solitary survivor, clinging to wreckage and memory. The hero who once commanded armies now faced the world alone, dependent on endurance rather than strategy. By the end of this chapter of his journey, Odysseus had crossed a fundamental threshold. He was no longer simply trying to return home. He was being reshaped by suffering into a figure capable of humility, patience, and restraint. The underworld had taught him the value of life. The sirens had tested his self-control, and the loss of his crew had stripped him of illusions about mastery and control. What remained was not the cunning warrior of Troy, but a man prepared, at last, to confront the deepest temptations of all: immortality, forgetfulness, and the abandonment of identity. When Odysseus emerged alive from the wreckage of his final ship, clinging to broken timbers amid the vast and hostile sea, he had reached the lowest point of his long journey. All his companions were dead, his fleet was gone, and the curse of Poseidon had been fulfilled in full. No longer a king, commander, or even a leader of men, Odysseus was reduced to a solitary survivor, sustained only by endurance and the stubborn refusal to surrender his identity. This moment of absolute isolation marks one of the most significant transitions in the epic, for Odysseus now faced dangers that could not be overcome through strategy or leadership alone. What awaited him was not another monster to outwit, but a temptation more subtle and profound than any he had previously encountered: the offer to escape mortality itself. Odysseus washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso, whose very name suggests concealment and entrapment. Unlike Circe, who transformed men into beasts, Calypso's power lay in preservation rather than destruction. She rescued Odysseus, nursed him back to health, and offered him shelter, companionship, and love. Her island was lush, abundant, and untouched by human suffering, a paradise removed from time, war, and decay. Over the years that followed, Calypso made Odysseus an extraordinary offer. If he would remain with her, she would grant him immortality and eternal youth, freeing him from the pain, loss, and uncertainty that define human life. At first glance, Calypso's offer appears irresistibly generous. After years of danger, grief, and exhaustion, Odysseus was given everything a mortal could desire: safety, beauty, love, and the promise of endless life. Yet Odysseus refused. Though he shared Calypso's bed and lived under her protection, his heart remained fixed on Ithaca. Each day he sat by the shore, gazing across the sea, weeping for home. This refusal reveals the deepest core of Odysseus's character and one of the central philosophical themes of the Odyssey. Immortality, in Homer's vision, is not an unqualified blessing. To live forever is to be severed from human meaning, which is rooted in memory, family, responsibility, and the acceptance of death. Odysseus chose mortality not because it was easier, but because it was authentic. Calypso's island thus becomes a place of suspended identity. Time passes, but purpose does not. Odysseus is neither fully captive nor fully free, neither fully content nor fully miserable. This liminal state reflects the psychological exhaustion of a man who has survived too much, yet refuses to forget who he is. Calypso herself is not portrayed as cruel. She genuinely loves Odysseus and cannot understand why he would choose a mortal woman, Penelope, over divine perfection. Odysseus's answer is never framed in terms of beauty or status, but of belonging. Penelope is mortal, imperfect, and aging, but she is part of a shared life shaped by struggle, memory, and choice. In choosing Penelope, Odysseus chooses humanity. The stalemate on Ogygia ends only when the gods intervene. Athena, who has long favored Odysseus for his intelligence and restraint, finally persuades Zeus that the hero's suffering has gone on long enough. Hermes is dispatched to command Calypso to release her captive. Though she protests the injustice of the gods, arguing that male gods freely take mortal lovers, while goddesses are punished for doing the same, she ultimately obeys. Her complaint exposes the arbitrary and often hypocritical nature of divine authority in the Homeric world, where power does not always align with fairness. Odysseus leaves Ogygia not triumphantly, but cautiously, building a raft with his own hands and trusting once more to the sea. Predictably, Poseidon discovers his escape and unleashes one final storm, nearly killing Odysseus before the goddess Ino provides him with magical aid. Exhausted and battered, Odysseus finally reaches the land of the Phaeacians, a turning point that marks the transition from survival to restoration. The Phaeacians represent the ideal of civilized hospitality, a society that honors the gods, respects strangers, and values storytelling and community. When Odysseus arrives, naked and half dead, he is discovered by Nausicaa, the king's daughter, who treats him with dignity and kindness. Odysseus's interaction with her reveals how far he has come since Troy. Gone is the boastful warrior who shouted his name at Polyphemus. Instead, Odysseus approaches with humility, careful speech, and respect, understanding that survival now depends on trust rather than clever deception. At the Phaeacian court, Odysseus conceals his identity, allowing himself to be treated as an anonymous stranger. This concealment is no longer an act of manipulation, but of self-protection and reflection. He listens as bards sing of the Trojan War, including stories of his own deeds, and he weeps silently, overwhelmed by memory. This moment underscores one of the epic's most important themes: storytelling as a bridge between personal suffering and communal understanding. Odysseus has lived his story, but he has not yet fully claimed it. When Odysseus finally reveals his identity and recounts his journey, the act of narration becomes transformative. For the first time, his suffering is ordered into meaning through language. He is no longer merely reacting to events, he is interpreting them. This extended narration, covering his adventures with the Cyclopes, Circe, the underworld, and the monsters of the sea, allows Odysseus to reclaim agency over his past. He becomes not just a survivor, but a storyteller, shaping memory into knowledge. The Phaeacians respond not with fear or envy, but with compassion and admiration. They provide Odysseus with gifts and safe passage home, restoring him to the status of a guest rather than a victim. Yet even here, divine politics intervene. Poseidon punishes the Phaeacians for helping his enemy, turning their returning ship to stone and warning them never again to aid strangers. This act reinforces the precariousness of human goodness in a world governed by volatile gods. Odysseus reaches Ithaca at last, though not in triumph. He arrives asleep, carried by the Phaeacians and deposited quietly on the shore. When he awakens, he does not recognize his homeland, for Athena has disguised it to test him. This final test marks the completion of Odysseus's transformation. Instead of boasting or demanding recognition, he responds cautiously, inventing a false identity and demonstrating the patience and restraint he has learned through suffering. Only then does Athena reveal herself and explain the final challenge awaiting him, the reclaiming of his home from the suitors. By the end of this chapter, Odysseus has completed the external journey, but stands at the threshold of the most difficult trial of all. The man who left Troy as a victorious warrior has been stripped of pride, companions, and illusions. What remains is a figure shaped by endurance, humility, and wisdom, prepared to confront injustice not through reckless violence, but through careful planning and moral judgment. The wanderer has returned, but the king must still be restored. When Odysseus finally set foot upon the soil of Ithaca, he did not return as a conquering hero welcomed by loyal subjects, nor as a king restored effortlessly to his throne. Instead, he returned as a stranger in his own land, forced to confront the unsettling truth that time, absence, and disorder had transformed his household into something almost unrecognizable. The final phase of Odysseus's journey would not be marked by storms or monsters, but by moral complexity, restraint, and the slow, deliberate reclamation of identity. This was the most demanding trial of all, for it required him to master not the external world, but his own rage, pride, and desire for immediate justice. During Odysseus's 20-year absence, 10 years at war and 10 years wandering, the social order of Ithaca had collapsed. Believing their king dead, a group of powerful noblemen had taken up residence in his palace, seeking to force his wife Penelope into marriage and claim the throne. These suitors were not merely unwelcome guests. They represented a fundamental violation of Greek moral law. They consumed Odysseus's livestock and wine, abused the customs of hospitality, disrespected the household gods, and plotted the murder of Odysseus's son Telemachus. Their presence symbolized chaos, greed, and moral decay, standing in stark contrast to the order and justice Odysseus once embodied as king. Athena, who had guided Odysseus throughout his journey, now insisted that strength alone would not suffice to defeat the suitors. The king must first understand the nature of the disorder he faced. To this end, she disguised Odysseus as a beggar, aged, filthy, and weak, stripping him of all outward signs of authority. This disguise was not merely tactical, it was profoundly symbolic. Odysseus, who once commanded armies and kings, was now forced to experience his own kingdom from the lowest social position possible. In doing so, he would learn who among his people remained loyal and who had embraced corruption. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus entered his palace and witnessed firsthand the arrogance of the suitors. They mocked him, insulted him, and subjected him to violence, treating him as less than human. Each insult tested Odysseus's self-control, and each act of humiliation deepened the tension between his instinct for revenge and his newly learned capacity for restraint. The hero who once revealed his name to Polyphemus out of pride now remained silent, swallowing his anger in service of a greater purpose. This patience marked the culmination of his moral transformation. At the same time, Odysseus quietly reconnected with allies who had remained faithful. His reunion with Telemachus was carefully staged, guided by Athena, and marked by mutual recognition and emotional restraint. Telemachus, who had grown from a passive boy into a young man capable of asserting himself, now stood beside his father as an equal partner in the restoration of order. Their alliance symbolized the continuity of generations and the survival of rightful authority through wisdom rather than brute force. One of the most poignant encounters during this period of disguise was Odysseus's interaction with Penelope. She too had been shaped by years of endurance, loneliness, and strategic patience. Like Odysseus, she had relied on intelligence rather than power to survive, delaying remarriage through cunning devices such as the weaving and unweaving of a burial shroud. When Penelope spoke with the disguised Odysseus, she revealed her deep sorrow, her loyalty, and her quiet strength. Yet she did not recognize him, nor did he reveal himself, for both understood, consciously or not, that truth must emerge at the right moment, tested and earned rather than declared. Penelope's intelligence matched Odysseus's own, and this intellectual equality lay at the heart of their relationship. Her refusal to accept any suitor without proof of Odysseus's death reflected not passivity but moral clarity. In this sense, Penelope functioned as Odysseus's mirror, embodying the same virtues of patience, cunning, and fidelity that defined his journey. Their eventual reunion would depend not on emotional excess but on shared knowledge and trust. The turning point came when Penelope announced a contest to decide her fate. She would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through a row of axe heads. This challenge was no mere test of strength. It was a deliberate trap designed to expose imposters and reveal the true king. The bow, a symbol of Odysseus's identity, required not only physical power, but intimate familiarity. None of the suitors could string it, no matter how arrogantly they tried. Their failure exposed the emptiness of their claims to authority. When the disguised beggar asked to attempt the challenge, the suitors mocked him, yet Penelope insisted on fairness, demonstrating her unwavering respect for justice even in a corrupted household. Odysseus strung the bow with effortless familiarity and released the arrow in a single perfect motion. In that instant, the years of disguise and suffering culminated in revelation. Odysseus cast off his beggar's rags and stood revealed as king. What followed was not a chaotic outburst of violence, but a calculated act of justice. With the help of Telemachus and loyal servants, Odysseus slaughtered the suitors systematically. Each death was framed not as personal vengeance alone, but as moral retribution for sustained injustice. The suitors had violated sacred laws, abused power, and threatened the survival of the household. Their punishment restored balance rather than perpetuating chaos. Yet even in victory, Odysseus exercised restraint. He spared those who had remained loyal and punished traitors according to their actions. Justice was measured, not indiscriminate. This distinction is crucial, for it separates Odysseus from the kind of blind rage that once defined heroic violence. He was no longer merely reacting to insult or injury. He was enforcing order with deliberate judgment. After the bloodshed, Odysseus faced his most intimate test, reunion with Penelope. She did not accept him immediately, refusing to be deceived by appearances or emotion. Instead, she tested him with knowledge known only to them, the secret of their immovable marriage bed, built around a living olive tree. When Odysseus reacted with indignation at the suggestion that the bed could be moved, Penelope recognized him fully. Their reunion was marked not by theatrical excess, but by mutual understanding, reaffirming that their bond was rooted in shared intelligence and trust. Yet the restoration of order did not end with the death of the suitors. Their families demanded vengeance, threatening to plunge Ithaca into further bloodshed. Odysseus stood ready to fight again, but Athena intervened, imposing peace and ending the cycle of violence. This divine intervention underscored one of the epic's final truths. Human justice, however necessary, is always precarious, and peace often depends on forces beyond human control. By the end of this chapter, Odysseus had reclaimed his home, his identity, and his place in the social order. Yet the victory was not one of triumph alone, but of hard-earned wisdom. The hero who once sought glory had learned that true authority rests in restraint, judgment, and the willingness to endure humiliation for the sake of justice. The journey that began with deception at Troy now approached its conclusion with a deeper understanding of responsibility, balance, and the cost of power. Although Odysseus had reclaimed his palace, slain the suitors, and reunited with Penelope, his journey was not yet complete. Homer does not allow the epic to conclude with simple triumph, for the restoration of order after long violence is never immediate or uncomplicated. The final stage of Odysseus's story is quieter than the battles and adventures that preceded it, yet it is no less profound. It explores reconciliation, responsibility, and the ultimate purpose of endurance, revealing that true homecoming is not merely a return to place, but a reconciliation with time, memory, and fate. The morning after the slaughter of the suitors dawned upon a palace cleansed of corruption, but heavy with the weight of bloodshed. Odysseus moved swiftly to secure his household, ordering the removal of the dead and the purification of the halls. These acts were not merely practical, but ritualistic, reflecting the Greek belief that violence disrupted cosmic and social balance and required cleansing to restore harmony. Odysseus understood that even justified violence left moral residue. Justice had been served, but peace had not yet been secured. News of the suitors' deaths spread rapidly throughout Ithaca, provoking grief and fury among their families. Fathers and brothers demanded vengeance, calling upon ancient customs that required blood to be answered with blood. The island stood on the brink of civil war, and once again Odysseus faced the possibility that violence, even when necessary, could spiral endlessly if left unchecked. This moment reveals the limits of human justice. No matter how righteous an act may be, it cannot fully erase suffering or silence all claims to retaliation. Odysseus prepared to meet this threat not with cunning or disguise, but openly as king. He armed himself and stood beside Telemachus and his loyal followers, ready to defend what he had restored. Yet the epic does not culminate in another battle. Instead, Athena intervenes, commanded by Zeus to impose peace upon Ithaca. The goddess halts the fighting, erases the memory of the suitors' crimes from the minds of their families, and establishes reconciliation through divine authority. This resolution emphasizes a crucial truth within Homeric thought. Human beings bound by emotion and honor are often incapable of ending cycles of violence without external intervention. Peace, fragile and imperfect, is ultimately a gift rather than a conquest. With order restored, Odysseus resumes his role as king, husband, and father, yet he does so as a changed man. The reckless confidence of his youth has been replaced by measured judgment, and the pride that once drove him to boast before Polyphemus has been tempered by humility. His authority now rests not in force alone, but in experience, patience, and understanding of human weakness. The trials he endured have reshaped him into a ruler capable of restraint as well as action. Central to this renewed order is Odysseus's relationship with Penelope, which emerges as one of the most balanced and intellectually equal partnerships in ancient literature. Their reunion is not portrayed as an emotional outpouring that erases years of absence, but as a gradual restoration of trust. Penelope's caution reflects her intelligence and strength, just as Odysseus's patience reflects his growth. Together, they embody the ideal Homeric marriage, one founded not merely on affection, but on shared endurance, mutual respect, and wisdom forged through suffering. Telemachus, too, stands transformed by the journey. Once uncertain and overshadowed by his father's legacy, he has matured into a capable heir who understands the responsibilities of leadership. His growth represents continuity and renewal, ensuring that Ithaca's future will not repeat the chaos of its recent past. Through Telemachus, Odysseus's legacy extends beyond personal survival to generational stability. Yet Homer does not allow the epic to end entirely within Ithaca's borders. The prophecy of Tiresias still looms, reminding Odysseus that fate cannot be evaded, only fulfilled. Tiresias had foretold that after restoring order at home, Odysseus must embark on one final journey inland, carrying an oar until he reached a land so distant from the sea that its people would mistake the oar for a winnowing fan. Only there could Odysseus appease Poseidon and secure lasting peace. This final journey is deeply symbolic. Odysseus, whose life has been defined by the sea, must now travel away from it, carrying the symbol of his suffering and survival into a world untouched by maritime conflict. The journey represents the reconciliation of Odysseus with the god who had tormented him for so long. It is not an act of submission, but of acknowledgement, an acceptance of limits and the need for balance between human ingenuity and divine power. Although Homer does not dwell extensively on this final voyage, its inclusion is crucial. It affirms that Odysseus' story is not merely about returning home, but about learning how to live peacefully after survival. The hero must not only endure hardship, but also release anger, pride, and the need for control. True wisdom lies in knowing when to struggle and when to yield. In reflecting on Odysseus' entire journey, one sees that the Odyssey is ultimately a story about identity. Odysseus survives not because he is the strongest or most favored, but because he adapts, learns, and remembers who he is. Memory of home, of family, of suffering serves as his anchor against forgetfulness, temptation, and despair. Whether resisting the lotus, rejecting immortality, or enduring humiliation in his own palace, Odysseus consistently chooses meaning over comfort. The gods in the epic function not merely as supernatural forces, but as reflections of the unpredictability of existence itself. They reward and punish inconsistently, demand respect without offering fairness, and shape human lives in ways beyond mortal control. Odysseus' greatness lies in his refusal to surrender agency in the face of this uncertainty. He neither defies the gods recklessly nor submits blindly. Instead, he navigates between reverence and resistance, embodying the human struggle to assert purpose in a world governed by forces beyond comprehension. By the time the epic concludes, Odysseus has become something greater than a warrior or trickster. He is a figure of endurance, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. His journey affirms that suffering, while destructive, can also be transformative, shaping wisdom, humility, and compassion. The Odyssey does not promise happiness without pain or justice without cost. Instead, it offers a vision of life in which meaning is forged through persistence, memory, and the refusal to abandon one's identity. In the end, Odysseus' homecoming is not defined by feasts or celebration, but by quiet restoration. The bed rooted in the living olive tree stands unchanged, a symbol of continuity amid chaos. Ithaca, scarred but stable, resumes its place in the world. The wanderer rests, not because the world has become safe or predictable, but because he has learned how to live within its uncertainty. Thus, the story of Odysseus endures not as a tale of monsters and adventure alone, but as one of the most profound explorations of what it means to be human, to suffer, to learn, to return, and finally to make peace with both the world and oneself. The Odyssey endures because it captures the complexity of human existence. Odysseus survives not through strength alone, but through adaptability, memory, and the refusal to abandon identity. His journey affirms that suffering can transform, wisdom requires restraint, and home is not merely a place, but a state of moral and emotional reconciliation. In the end, Odysseus rests not because the world is safe, but because he has learned how to live within its uncertainty. His story remains one of the most profound explorations of what it means to be human.